Dawn came up thin over the Medway, the river a flat sheet of pewter under a sky the color of ash, when the battleship Bulwark broke the morning in half. At 7:53 a.m. on November 26, 1914, a white flash bled through the fog off Sheerness, and the ship simply tore itself apart. Dockyard workers looked up from coal barges and yard rails in time to see the midships leap with flame, a shockwave run like a fist across the water, and then the air fill with pieces of steel and worse. Windows shattered in Sheerness, and on the Essex shore, people ran to doorways thinking a mine had gone off in the channel. What they saw when the smoke parted was a mooring buoy ringed by wreckage where a 15,000-ton warship had stood a minute before. Only minutes earlier, Bulwark was morning quiet, moored at number. 17 buoy in Kethole Reach, 4 nautical miles west of Sheerness. She was a pre-dreadnought, the old, formidable class kind the Royal Navy still used for patrols and guard duty, while the Grand Fleet's big ships hunted the high seas fleet. Since August, she had shepherded troop movements across the Channel and then fallen back into the Medway to coal, take on stores, and drill. Her crew, hundreds of sailors plus a visiting band from HMS Excellent, was settling into the routines of a workday, the steady turn of winches and the clink of coal into bunkers. The watch could not have known what sat quietly in the spaces between bulkheads and decks. Cordite propellant, packed in silk bags and stored in the after magazines, had been moved and restowed in recent days as the ship took in ammunition. Some charges were kept too close to a boiler room bulkhead or left in passageways while crews worked. The official court of inquiry would later rule out a torpedo or mine. Eyewitnesses spoke of a flash by the after 12-inch turret, then 1 or 2 rapid internal detonations, the signature of a magazine gone. There was no towering pillar of water, no geyser thrown up by an outside blow. It came from within. Men on nearby ships felt the heat on their faces. On shore, the dockyard sirens wailed, and boats pushed off into floating smoke. But there was almost no one to save. The explosion had cut the ship into grisly fragments. The bow and stern lifted clear and then folded down, the middle vanishing in a thunder of steel. Of a complement of roughly 750, only about a dozen men would be pulled alive from the water, many burned or broken. All the officers on board were killed. By that afternoon, only a few dozen bodies had been recovered. The rest lay in the river or were gone entirely, carried into the estuary on the morning tide. News reached London immediately. In the House of Commons, the First Lord of the Admiralty stood and told members that Bulwark had blown up at anchor near Sheerness, that both admirals on the spot believed it was a magazine explosion, that the loss of life was severe. Flags dipped around the fleet. In Kent, people swept glass from shop floors and counted the cost of a war that had found them without warning on an ordinary morning. Bulwark's story did not end with that communiqué. Investigators moved quickly because fear moved faster. Britain's southeast was alive with anxiety about German mines, U-boats, and saboteurs. Divers went down in the Medway's cloudy water and found what the witnesses had described. Wreckage blown outward, plating curled like leaves, the pattern of pressure moving from inside the hull out. The court convened at Sheerness 2 days later and, with the first interviews and technical reports, rejected the idea of an external attack. They came back to Cordite and to the way a ship at anchor becomes a busy, cluttered place when she is loading coal and shells. Cordite was the Royal Navy's accelerant of choice, a powerful mixture that had to be treated like a temperamental house guest, kept cool, dry, and away from heat. In the rush of wartime routines, it could be mishandled. In Bulwark's case, the court believed charges had been stacked where a warm bulkhead slowly heated them. A spark, perhaps a fall of metal, perhaps static, was enough to start a small fire that flashed back to the magazine and became something no crew could fight. It was the same family of mistakes that would later take the cruisers Natal and Vanguard, a lesson written in flames and repeated until it stuck. The human reckoning was immediate. Naval lists would eventually settle on roughly 741 dead, a number so large it was hard to fathom. Bandsmen, stokers, signalers, shipwrights on detached duty. Whole sections of the ship's life erased between one pipe of the boatswain's call and the next breath. The Admiralty notified families by telegram. Dockyard towns wore black. In Portsmouth, at HMS Excellent, the band's empty chairs told the story as clearly as any headline. Memorials multiplied, at Sheerness, at Rochester, and on the roll of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Only a handful of survivors lived to tell fragments. A light, a roar, a fall into cold water, the sudden silence after sound too loud to be sound at all. The practical response moved just as quickly. Inspections across the fleet tightened procedures for handling and restowing charges, especially during coaling and ammunitioning, when the ship's interior could become a clutter of temporary piles. Thermometers were hung by bulkheads adjacent to magazines. Drill sheets were amended to make sure hatches stayed open when charges were in passage. It was a bureaucratic language for grief. Hazard notices, safety checks, signatures at the bottom of forms meant to keep another crew from facing what bulwarks had faced. Yet Friday mornings in Kent kept their memory. People could point to the places where glass had sprayed across the cobbles, to the slates that never sat quite flat again, to the stories of debris falling in gardens 10 miles away. The explosion had stamped itself onto a map of working lives, fitters at Chatham, riveters at Sheerness, barge hands on the Medway, and onto home fronts that were only beginning to understand what industrial war meant. Men went back to work, because that is what men do, but the river stayed different. A minute at 7:53 had changed it. Eyewitnesses remembered a sheet of flame rising near the after turret, then a second, heavier burst that lifted armor and guns before the center of the ship vanished. In Southend, across the water, people thought an earthquake had come. Crockery jumped in cupboards, and shop fronts cracked from the pressure. On the river, smoke drifted in ropes, while papers and splinters fell like burned snow, and for a long minute, nothing moved except the echo rolling away toward the Nore. For sailors, the worst part of such a loss is how little seamanship can do. You can navigate weather, drill for fire, practice collision stations, even learn the habits of an enemy. An internal magazine explosion gives you almost nothing. No horizon to watch, no helm order to answer, only a last thought and the force of the blast. That is why the Bulwark sits beside other names from those years as a kind of warning bell. She was not defeated in gunnery or outmaneuvered at sea. She was undone by the small mistakes that hide in busy ships, by chemistry and heat that got their moment. In the end, the Medway was calm again, the slicks fading, the tugs back on their lines. The mooring buoy at Kethole Reach held its silence. Newspapers printed casualty columns and then turned to new battles. But if you stand on the shore below Sheerness on a gray November morning and listen to the tide come up the channels, the story is still there. Short, violent, and heavy. The blast at anchor carried through dockyard streets, across the estuary, and into the long memory of the war, a reminder that sometimes the deadliest thing a ship meets is what she carries within her. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.